and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Laura.
I'm Kate.
And this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get you talking. Every episode, we sit down to chat about the book read most recently by one of our book clubs. What did we make of it? Did it spark debate? And whether we loved it or loathed it, the big question is always, were they great book club books?
Today, we're discussing the two books read most recently by each of our book clubs. Two Serious Ladies by Jane Bowles, which was Laura's latest book club choice, and A Horse Walks Into a Bar, read by my book club. And for our regular interview, we sat down with Kat Brown from the Jilly Cooper Book Club, who explains that it's not just about the bonking.
I suppose because these books are so joyful and funny and witty and filled with great jokes, it's joie-de-vivre basically, and we need all that we can get of that in current times.
All that, plus our usual recommendations for your next book club read, inspired by Two Serious Ladies and A Horse Walks Into a Bar. Hi Kate.
Hi Laura. How are you?
I'm very well. It's a Tuesday. I should be at work, but I've taken the day off.
Yeah, this is very...
I feel like I'm playing hooky. It's very exciting.
And we're in the shed, the poor shed, which under the harsh winter snows that we've been... we had, an inch of snow? It was basically a kind of nationwide catastrophe. But the poor shed, it's developed a leak.
Sprung a leak.
I know, it's very...
But yet, luckily, it's clear skies for now, so we've got a few hours, I think, before it starts dripping again. And here we are to talk about Two Serious Ladies by Jane Bowles.
I know I always say this, but I had never heard of this book.
I had never heard of it either.
But it's surprising, because then when I did get hold of a copy, it's covered in plaudits from writers like Truman Capote, Tennessee Williams. Claire Massoud wrote my introduction and was fulsome in her praise of it. So yeah, it just seemed even more anomalous that it had just never come up on my radar. How did you come to choose it?
We were talking about reading a classic, and I was kind of thinking something Russian, actually. And then Frances kind of blindsided me with the recommendation for Two Serious Ladies by Jane Bowles. And I was like, oh, sure. Yeah, that sounds good. She had heard of it because Ali Smith, who's written Autumn, is a big fan of Jane Bowles. And Jane Bowles is this sort of literary figure who lots of people seem to know about and admire. But then again, other people have never heard of her, certainly not me. She was a real character. She lived a really fascinating life. Her husband, Paul Bowles, was a very well-known writer, and she was friends with Truman Capote. She knew Tennessee Williams. I think she lived in a housing block in New York for a little while with Gypsy Rose Lee. So she was very much in this artistic milieu. And although she was married, she and her husband both had same-sex relationships with other people, even as they seem to have remained very good friends. She also travelled around the world and didn't actually spend that much time in America, I think, after the 1940s.
Yeah, it says here she lived in Tangier, Morocco with her husband from 1952 until her death in 1973.
And this book was written or published in 1943. I think they believe it was written around 1939, 1940. It's the only novel she's ever written. It's quite something.
Why don't we start with the reading quite early on?
Okay.
Because I think it's quite important to get a sense of what the process is.
To introduce our Two Serious Ladies.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Well, I was going to read from the end, and I think on that note, maybe it's just useful to say this is the kind of book you can't really talk about without giving away spoilers. So, listeners, you have been warned.
Okay. Don't know why I'm saying that. I've read it. But I'm feeling warned.
Ms. Goring and Mrs. Copperfield, they are our two protagonists.
Right.
They are our two serious ladies, and their paths only cross at two moments in the book. The first time it's at a party, maybe not quite a third, maybe a quarter of the way in, when Miss Goring happens upon Mrs. Copperfield. At the end of that party, the perspective switches to Mrs. Copperfield and her trip to Panama. And then it goes back to Mrs. Goring's perspective towards the last third, and then they meet again when Miss Goring calls Mrs. Copperfield down to a restaurant, and they're reunited. When her friend returned from the telephone, Miss Goring saw immediately that something was very much the matter. Mrs. Copperfield fell into her seat. She says that she does not know when she is coming down, and if she is not here by the time you feel like leaving, I am to return home with you, or all alone by myself. It's happened to me now, hasn't it? But the beauty of me is that I am only a step from desperation all the time, and I am one of the few people I know who could perform an act of violence with the greatest of ease. She waved her hand over her head. Acts of violence are generally performed with ease, said Miss Goring. She was at this point completely disgusted with Mrs. Copperfield, who rose from her seat and walked in a crooked path over to the bar. There she stood taking drink after drink without turning her little head, which was almost completely hidden by the enormous fur collar on her coat. Miss Goring went up to Mrs. Copperfield just once, thinking that she might persuade her friend to return to the table, but Mrs. Copperfield showed a furious, tear-stained face to Miss Goring and flung her arm out sideways, striking Miss Goring in the nose with her forearm. Miss Goring returned to her seat and sat nursing her nose.
Yeah, that is a good bit to read because it brings up quite a few relevant issues. I think the kind of confusing social dynamics between characters and also the sort of incidental violence, of which there's quite a lot kind of peppered throughout the book, which is just sort of interesting. I mean, when I finished reading this book, I think, let's be upfront at the beginning, I don't think I've ever read anything that left me feeling so bewildered. And the first note I wrote in the back is titled, "What is this book about?" And I put two women, Miss Goring and Miss Copperfield, who each seemed to want, and then I sort of thought, what do they want? I thought, to debase themselves. Miss Copperfield rejects a comfortable marriage with a pleasant enough ceiling.
He doesn't seem that bad.
Husband, he seemed fine to me. Miss Goring has financial independence. They both actually have financial independence and security, don't they? But Miss Goring, that's the main thing she has. And she wants to throw that away. She wants to lose that. Miss Copperfield believes herself to be passionately attached to a 15-year-old Colombian prostitute called Pacifica, who she meets on her travels.
I didn't realise that she was that young.
Yeah.
Okay.
Other characters, to me, just seemed apparently pointless. They don't seem to add or detract in any way from the main story, but then I found myself confused as to what the main story was. So, can your book club help shed any light?
Oh, well, it was one of those books where I looked forward to discussing it simply to try and bring some context to what I was reading. But everyone was reasonably baffled.
Oh, good. It wasn't just me then.
we now have two Alices in my book club, and the new Alice summed it up as a series of weird decisions.
Right.
Which just about makes sense. You know,
That's
there's
the quote I would put on the back.
There's really no rhyme or reason to what they are doing. Now, Frances, who suggested this book, said, well, you know, that Jane Bowles was writing at a time when you had surrealism and the beginning of existentialism, and there was this sense of alienation from traditional moral values, and, you know, the belief in religion had failed. And so there was this sort of pursuit of authenticity through experience. And that's what these two women seem to be trying to push for, is that kind of, I mean, it doesn't make any sense because you're not sure why they're doing anything. They're not sure why they're doing anything, but they're committed to making themselves uncomfortable.
So that's the strongest thread you can identify, isn't it? Is that they each of them in their own way deliberately seek out situations which ultimately leave them feeling horrible.
Yeah. And somehow there's a kind of a purity and authenticity there.
And I thought, you know, that was quite intriguing about this. You know, normally when we read novels with female central characters, they are seeking some kind of freedom or empowerment. I mean, that's generally... Yeah. Am I right in thinking that's sort of perhaps generally what I'm expecting?
Maybe that's what we kind of expect from a modern feminist novel.
Yeah, well, I don't know, but even something written... You know, the 1950s is not that long ago.
No.
And this did completely sort of wrong foot that expectation. It's almost like these women had independence. They had a certain amount of agency.
Yeah.
And they seemed to want to lose it.
That's true. Yeah.
And so it inverted that kind of, perhaps, you know, your immediate expectation of what was going to happen, which was interesting.
Sort of.
Yeah. But to what purpose? To what purpose? That's the ultimate question. And I think the fact that that isn't clear is fundamentally the flaw with this novel. Because if there's an idea so interesting and so clever underlying what we're reading with the plot and the characters, if ultimately it's not apparent in any way, and it really wasn't. No. I mean, I was looking quite hard. Did she succeed or fail? I mean, I would have to say that I think she failed.
Well, we have different editions of Two Serious Ladies. The introduction to my edition flags the fact that there was a third serious lady called Senorita Cordoba who just got dropped from the book. And I don't know if that kind of just tainted how I read it. But for me, it just felt like a very creative individual in a creative milieu thinking, I could write a novel. Why don't I just sit down and write some things? And kind of just writing down stream of consciousness thoughts that came to her about what these women might get up to, but without any real care or craft. I got really challenged by this. Frances was like, no. She knows what she's doing. And I was like, well, does she? I mean, the fact that she just dropped one of her serious ladies when she couldn't be bothered to kind of flesh out that narrative made me feel it was all a bit sketched together. She was very young when she wrote this. She was in her mid-20s.
I mean, sketched, it lacked coherence to me. And it was interesting actually reading the biography in my introduction that she did struggle with alcoholism throughout her life. And I mean, before I knew that, I was sort of thinking, this feels to me like something someone wrote when they were drunk. And that's an awful kind of assumption to make. But I think also the thing that I found really unsettling about it was I felt it had been written by someone who was deeply unhappy. And that couldn't help but creep into what she was writing. And I was very troubled by that. This interest in this sort of self-destruction, I don't know. It just made me uncomfortable.
It felt quite autobiographical in that sense, even though...
perhaps.
Well, even I don't know that much
but
about
it's so
Jane
oblique.
Bowles' life. Yeah,
everything about it is so hard to kind of decode.
It is unique in its focus on women and women's relationships and quite dysfunctional relationships between women.
Yes, because when men appear in this narrative, they're very much secondary characters.
Yes, and often they're very violent. There's a really disturbing rape scene when Pacifica and Mrs. Copperfield, they've just had a nap.
Oh, yes.
And
And
one
this
of
man
Pacifica's
beats down the
clients-
door. And then Miss Copperfield, because she's got this desire to kind of seek out these horrible experiences, Pacifica's saying, no, don't let him in. I know what he wants, don't let him in. And Mrs. Copperfield's like, no, we must. And she goes and opens the door.
Exactly. And then she runs away.
Yes.
And has a conversation with the hotel owner,
Yes.
with Mrs. Quill, who's like, oh, I think Pacifica really wants it. And you're
I
kind of
know,
like,
yeah.
what?
But
What's
so
going on?
It's the other problem, perhaps, which we should flag up, is that they're actually very hard to like. And the strange thing about that is that even the author doesn't like them very much. It begins with Miss Goering and her childhood and her relationship with her sister. When I first started reading this, I was kind of intrigued.
I
thought,
was quite
this
excited.
is going to be good. Yeah.
The opening childhood sequence is really intriguing.
As a child, Christina Goering, this is. As a child, Christina had been very much disliked by other children. She had never suffered particularly because of this, having led, even at a very early age, an active inner life that curtailed her observation of whatever went on around her, to such a degree that she never picked up the mannerisms then in vogue, and at the age of 10 was called old-fashioned by other little girls. Even then, she wore the look of certain fanatics who think themselves as leaders without once having gained the respect of a single human being.
There are these really sharp, funny moments sometimes in the prose. And I have read a lot about how this book is supposed to be very funny. It certainly didn't make me laugh. One of the things that my book club struggled with was the fact that there's really no description. So there's no description of the characters, but also of where you are. So, they say they're at the harbour in Panama, and that's all you're given. And Neha was like, I've been to different harbours. I can picture a harbour, but God knows if my vision of the harbour is in any way similar to other people's visions of the harbour, which becomes quite a weird reading experience because everyone is just having to fill in these massive gaps in description with their own kind of history, effectively, whatever they've seen in life.
And they're just all so horrible to each other. They're all so horrible to themselves, to other people, to everyone they encounter, every character.
We haven't talked about Arnold and Arnold's father and Miss Gamelon.
So
these hangers-on.
Arnold is a man that Miss Goering meets at a party who invites her home with him, and so she decides to go.
By a little note.
She has this just awful night where he turns out to live in some tiny apartment. His parents live there as well. She meets the father, and the father is, of all the characters in this book, perhaps he's the one character who has something of the kind of bit of charisma and charm about him.
Yeah.
But even that, it's sort of strangely contrived and you don't know what his gender is. Then Arnold decides that he doesn't really want her to be there and he'd rather just go to sleep, but she's sort of trapped. She can't go anywhere else. And so then she ends up having to spend the night in the spare room, which is the most depressing, uncomfortable space that you could possibly imagine.
Yeah.
I mean, everything about it is just wretched. She decides she's going to leave her lovely, comfortable house that she's inherited from her parents and move herself to this wretched dwelling that she finds out in the kind of, suburb somewhere.
It was on an island, and there was like the stench of factories wafting over
Exactly.
from the
So
mainland.
she deliberately seeks out the most awful place that she can find, and Arnold decides that he's going to come and live there with her.
Yes, with Miss Gamelon.
Miss Gamelon, who's this other sort of strange friend that she sort of picked up along the way, who again is basically motivated because she wants her money, isn't it?
Yes, I think so. But that's what's strange is they keep hanging out together.
Yeah.
Even though Ms. Goring has kind of given up all worldly possessions and just settled down in this miserable hovel.
But at what point does it matter that it's just not realistic? I mean, at one point, Arnold, who's very jealous of Miss Gamelon for some reason, comes in and, without any sort of ceremony or warning, hits her over the head with an ashtray.
Yeah.
And Miss Gamelon is sort of struck and bleeding. But she doesn't say, "What on earth are you doing? you crazy man, you just hit me over the head." You know, she doesn't say any of that. She just sort of quietly goes out of the room and then comes back later with a tissue or something.
And then the next day, they're firm friends.
Yeah. Yes, it does ultimately prove to be a bonding experience. But the point is, no one would react like that. What was that about?
It's a very, very strange novel. Some people have said that it reads more like a play, and actually Jane Bowles wrote plays as well as novels. I say novels, novel. She only wrote one.
Yeah, because perhaps it's that thing where if you had some actors to give these characters some sense of an inner life. It's interesting. I mean, these quotes from people who rated her so highly. Truman Capote deemed her one of the truly original pure stylists. James Purdy said she was an unmatchable talent. Tennessee Williams announced that she was the most important writer of prose fiction in modern American letters.
Maybe she was. I mean, it's difficult to know because she was writing in 1943. She was writing at a time, we have Beckett soon and we have Pinter and we have Camus coming up with existentialism. So she was kind of tapping into something, and it was really groundbreaking for the time. We did talk about my book club, her focus on quite strange women, very independent of normal society, living by their own code. It remains unusual even now.
It is strange, but unfortunately not for me in any way that I found the least bit intriguing.
No, I didn't want to read it. I really struggled to get through it.
Was Frances happy that what was your book club's reaction? Did it make for a good discussion book?
I don't know. It was a very small book club, which is often a sign that lots of people just gave up and thought, nah, I'm not going to bother. I wouldn't recommend it as a book club book, but then I might recommend it as sort of an addition to a reading list if you were reading kind of absurdist fiction or existential fiction.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the problem. It's not really a great discussion when the main thing that you're going to be talking about was, what on earth does this mean? Why on earth would she put this in? Why would this character do this?
Well, and how does it fit into literary history?
Just trying to make sense of it.
That might be interesting,
yeah.
But that's not really for me what book club's all about. I want to kind of engage with the book on its own terms, not within a larger literary context.
And so this nihilistic quality it did feel quite original. I mean, I certainly never read anything like it, but ultimately I didn't feel like I gained anything from reading it. I didn't really learn anything, and it wasn't a pleasure to read. And so
this is very damning.
Yeah,
you say it in measured
just
tones,
the main
but
check boxes of why I read something. It didn't really go anywhere near any of them.
So I don't even know if I'd recommend it as a book to read, except perhaps as a unique and unusual experience.
Yes. Because it was ultimately quite boring, wasn't it, really?
Yeah, it was really boring. It was really boring.
Because, when you've got these characters and you don't care what they do or say or what's going to happen to them next, and you know that even whatever you do read, you're not going to like very much.
And there's no narrative tension.
Yeah.
And there's no, character development.
I think we're being too nice about it.
Yeah, okay. I do wonder a little bit. It's very good that we're going back into literary history and kind of discovering gems written by women that may not have had the attention they deserved at the time or since.
But it sounds like she did get a reasonable amount of attention, so we can't even say, well, she was so neglected and ignored.
I almost feel like she wasn't neglected or ignored because she herself was quite an amazing individual.
Yeah, well, I would, exactly. I mean, if she was impossibly, charismatic and fabulous, it would certainly explain why they were all so wowed by her.
I think that's it.
But it doesn't explain why Claire Massoud liked her so much.
Well, I'm always very skeptical of the term cult classic. Because I think as soon as you add cult to it, it becomes kind of a status symbol to like it rather than it just being a regular classic. And I often feel, if you don't love a cult classic, the fault is sort of on you, right? You're not
in the know.
You're not in the know. You're missing something. I'm unashamed to say I seem to have been missing something when it came to Two Serious Ladies.
The author, Jilly Cooper, has written numerous best-selling books, but is she queen of the bonkbuster or the Jane Austen of our times? Who better to tell us than journalist Kat Brown, who is such a fan she set up a book club devoted to the theme? Along the way, she found new friendships and had what in Jilly Cooper land would generally be known as riotous fun. But first things first, just what is it about Jilly Cooper that inspires such devotion?
She is just such a wonderful writer, and I love the fact that you could instantly remember some of her books, even though you might not have read her for absolutely years. In the 70s, her books would be plastered with the most amazing quote from Harper's, which called her the Jane Austen of our time, and that is why we are so drawn to Jilly Cooper's writing, because she writes people, women, and especially men, better than pretty much any author I know.
And sex.
Oh, yes. There are huge adventurous sex lives in these books, and everybody really, really enjoys themselves. There are a few characters for whom guilt about sex or just not feeling very into it is really a part of their character. But then as soon as they find the right person or they find the right scenario, you know, they're happy as clams, or really, to use a Jillyism, joyous as otters.
So tell us about the book club. What led you to start your Jilly Cooper Book Club?
I met a girl on Twitter who turned out to be a mutual friend, and we discovered that we both adored Jilly Cooper. And we went out for dinner at Brasserie Zadie and both brought along a friend each who were sort of fellow Jillyites. And we all got utterly plastered and thought, this would be the greatest thing ever. And then I think we put a post about it on Twitter, and we ended up at Vinoteca in King's Cross, eating gull's eggs, as Taggy Campbell-Black would hugely approve of, and drinking vast quantities of wine, and actually having no book discussion whatsoever because everybody was so thrilled to be surrounded by other people that just love Jilly Cooper. The book club's now been going for, this is coming up to its third year, so obviously we've been through certainly the big bonkbusters quite a few times, and we've gone out to the non-fiction and the smaller romances. But what I find completely compelling about this book club, because I have been in some others, is because everybody knows these books so well, we all started reading them at that particular point in life, in your teens, when books start really becoming a part of your identity and your personality and mean so much more. We can actually get into really deep, analytical, almost, postdoctoral study about each of these books. There's poetry, there's clothing, there's social study, and there are bloody good plots. I suppose because these books are so joyful and funny and witty and filled with great jokes, it's joie-de-vivre, basically. And, we need all that we can get of that in current times.
Sometimes perhaps people maybe who aren't so familiar with her writing might be a bit dismissive of her. But as you mentioned earlier, they are chock full of literary references. I love the fact that characters are constantly quoting poetry at one another.
I suppose the comparison that I will make, and this will probably sound mad, is that there is a hashtag on Instagram at the moment called, I think, War and Peace 18. And a books blogger started this because she had never read War and Peace. She'd always been really put off it, and now she and a bunch of other people have gone, yeah, okay, this year I'm going to read War and Peace and I'll document it. And I basically feel about War and Peace how a lot of people feel about Jilly Cooper. I'm looking at it going, my God, that's a big book. Oh my God, there's just so many people. How do you keep track of all the people? And don't they all basically have the same name? Aren't they essentially like the same Sloane with a different hairstyle, but in Russia? The thing is you can't sort of force people to read a book, which is why it's so lovely having our book group, which seems to get bigger with every passing year. We've got loads of people, some of whom have only come once or twice or, live miles away. We've got people who live in Egypt and America who still chime in on Facebook and on WhatsApp and everything and give their contributions and come to meetings when they're over. But I think it's just knowing that there is that community of people that is as madly keen on Jilly Cooper as you are and wants to talk about it incessantly.
There is an argument to say that reading them as a contemporary feminist can be slightly challenging, depending on how strong your views are, I suppose. How do you feel about that? In some ways, they're quite unreconstructed.
Whilst Jilly, I think, is not very keen on the kind of feminism that may have been quite prevalent then, in the terms of feminism with women being equal, there are a shed load of those. You've got the ghastly Janie, or wonderful Janie, depending on which side of the books you're on, who's a Fleet Street journalist who's incredibly hardworking, hardcore, massively well paid. Again, the books are filled with people who actually may not have existed so much in real life, but are given a huge opportunity to be wildly successful in the books and in different fields and in careers, whilst happening to be women at the same time. And I love the fact that all of her characters, no matter what their sexual proclivities, no matter which way they swing, no matter what gender they are all fully rounded people. I think as a teenager, these books were incredibly important for me to read because I didn't know who I was. All I knew was that I didn't want to live in the middle of Hampshire for the rest of my life, and I wanted to achieve something, but I didn't know how to do it. And, for example, polo, as mentioned earlier, Perdita knows from the off that she wants to be the greatest polo player of all time, and she's going to do her damnedest to achieve that. Rupert Campbell-Black knows that he's going to be the best show jumper of all time, and then when he turns his mind to politics, he's going to be the best minister that he can possibly be. And reading books that are filled with these people who are so assured is incredibly inspiring.
If you were to recommend just one Jilly Cooper book to a book club, which one would you go for?
Oh, so my favourite, and I'm pleased that I can tell everybody because I found this out in November, my favourite and Jilly's favourite is Rivals, which is an amazing, amazing, amazing book. Rollicking, I believe, is the official term when you're regarding women's fiction, about the world of TV consortiums. It features incredibly intricate female characters. It's got a wonderful love story of how Rupert ends up meeting and falling in love with his second wife. Rupert only has 2 wives, but it sort of feels like he's had about 1 million because he's slept with so many people. And it's just joyous. But if you want something smaller, then one of the romances, which are all named things like Harriet, Octavia, Bella and Emily, and they're all absolutely glorious, but my favourite one is Harriet. I recommend the really old Corgi editions because Jilly was actually the model for each of the characters on the front, and it is just lovely. I think those are fantastic intros to her world.
And are you open to new members? How can people find out about you?
Yes, we've got a Facebook group. We use the Jilly Book Club hashtag on Instagram and Twitter. People are always welcome if they want to drop me a line on Twitter or something. What this book club has become is a huge support network for us all. We're quite open about talking about all sorts of things. Even people who joined relatively recently, I now consider to be among some of my dearest friends. And that sounds so odd, but I think it's like developing these huge, thumping great crushes on people and creating these new, wonderful relationships with women. And that is something that we all come back to so much, is that it can be quite difficult to make new friendships when you're in your 30s or 40s because, you know, your groups are all quite set. And yet here we are with this whole new bunch of completely mad, wonderful, glorious friends.
And in your life as a journalist, have you ever actually encountered Jilly in person?
I've only encountered her once through being a journalist, although I will say every journalist on Fleet Street who's ever interviewed her has the warmest stories. We've, as a book group, have had quite a lot of letters from her. She gave me a phone call the other day, which was lovely. These were things that we never expected, and that these have all become a lovely side result of why we started doing this in the first place, which was because we love the books, we love the world, and we wanted to read about it much more. And the fact that Jilly finds pleasure or happiness in the fact that a load of insane fangirls, male and female, want to talk about her a lot is just wonderful.
Oh, I think it sounds brilliant. Kat, thanks so much for telling me about the Jilly Cooper Book Club.
Thank you.
Have you ever read any Jilly Cooper?
I have. I went on holiday one year with my parents when I was probably about 14 or 15.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure I read Polo.
Oh.
You know,
with
the jet.
and
I guess so. I don't even remember her name, but I do remember the jet-setting lifestyle and traveling around to all these different shows and the romance. I don't remember the sex, actually. But I know. I would have thought that kind of was made a real impression. But I remember the glamour, and that's what's so interesting about Kat bringing that up, is, you know, reading these books in Hampshire as a teenager and kind of expanding your world and making you realize you want more. That resonates, I think, with Polo, but also with other books you read when you're a teen.
Yeah, I think it is that thing about those books that you encounter in those impressionable years that stay with you. And I think certainly that explains to some degree the sheer love and affection people have, you know, even while acknowledging that, you know, it might not be the finest, most crafted works of literature that you can read, but there's something wonderful about them nonetheless, and they're to be cherished, I think.
I want to read Rivals now. To be fair, I think I should just read them all, really. It sounds like it's a cultural institution. I just loved Kat's enthusiasm.
Yeah.
I do think that book clubs are brilliant for getting, like, you can have such superficial discussions with people on a day-to-day basis, but then somehow talking about fiction, sometimes non-fiction, you just get into the real grit of life.
Yeah, I think book clubs is a way of sustaining friendships and also exploring new ones. That is actually one of their key pleasures and delights.
I see my book club members, book club friends, they are friends, way more often than I see my friends otherwise because it's scheduled.
Yeah,
Like I've got to see them every 4 to 6 weeks.
Exactly. It's that thing where you make that date, you're going to keep that date in the diary because it's book club. And actually, as life gets busy and we all just get kind of pulled in 100 different directions, it's a really nice way of making sure you keep in touch with people.
I think it's also nice to deep dive into a specific author's oeuvre. To be pretentious, but you know, it's like, you know, it's the same as the Proust Book Club, really. I mean, just people who are very enthusiastic about an author and getting together to talk about it.
Yes, you're right. I hadn't made that parallel, but you're right.
Exactly the same thing. Proust and Jilly Cooper. The second of our books today is A Horse Walks into a Bar by David Grossman. This was the latest read of Kate's book club, and I got to join because it was the annual Christmas book club, which is not to be missed. So I crashed once again.
We do a quiz.
It's pretty impressive.
We had it at Natalie's house. She is the queen of Christmas. No one comes close. And it was lots of fun. This time of year, we normally read whichever book wins the Booker Prize. But this year it was Lincoln in the Bardo, which we'd already read.
Mm-hmm.
So we decided instead to read the winner of the International Booker Prize, which is the prize awarded for a book in translation, and we chose...
The judges
this,
chose.
That's right. This year's winner was Horse Walks into a Bar, which was originally written in Hebrew. David Grossman is an Israeli author. The structure of it's quite interesting. It doesn't have any chapters. It's quite short. It probably takes, if you read it straight through, an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours to read.
Really?
I think, well, the point being, it's set in a comedy nightclub. And it follows the show of this stand-up comedian who's one of the two main characters. His name's Dovale
G.
Dovale G, that's right. So the idea we thought was quite interesting, and we actually thought worked very well, is that the format of the novel follows that idea that you sit down and you watch a show. And it begins, good evening, good evening, good evening to the majestic city of Caesarea. The stage is empty. The thundering shout echoes from the wings. The audience slowly quietens down and grins expectantly. A short, slight, bespectacled man lurches onto the stage from a side door as if he'd been kicked through it. He takes a few faltering steps, trips, breaks himself on the wooden floor with both hands, and then sharply juts his rear end straight up. Scattered laughter and applause from the audience. People are still filing into the club, chattering loudly. Ladies and gentlemen, announces a tight-lipped man standing at the lighting console, put your hands together for Dovale G. The man on stage still crouches like a monkey, his big glasses askew on his nose. He slowly turns to face the room and scans it with a long, unblinking look. Oh, wait a minute, he grumbles. This isn't Caesarea, is it? Sounds of laughing. He slowly straightens up and dusts his hands off. Looks like my agent fucked me again.
And so on. And so
it
on.
goes on.
And so on.
So, yes, the conceit is that he is on stage performing this stand-up show, and in the audience is a man who is a
childhood friend.
A friend of his, from childhood, who he has telephoned and persuaded to come and be there. Mm-hmm. And the childhood friend, they lost touch. They've been out of touch for years and years and years.
Yeah, he barely remembers him. So Dovale G calls him up, and the narrator, who's been a quite successful high-profile judge, thinks it might be a bit of a scam, and he doesn't remember this guy. And we slowly learn about why he may have wiped his friendship with Dovale G as a child from his memory.
Yeah, it feels like it's playing with one of the most sort of fundamental ideas about stand-up comedy, I think, which is the sort of tears of a clown thing. Often these are people who, you know, the compulsion to sort of stand up in front of a room full of people and try and make them laugh is in some way they're sort of exposing their inner selves. I think this novel took that idea and wove a narrative from that actually worked absolutely beautifully, because what we learn is that Dovale had a very difficult relationship with his parents, who were both deeply unhappy people for actually quite understandable reasons.
The book club, there was mixed reactions about whether or not anyone was actually moved by this novel.
Yeah.
I was.
I feel like, you know, as a writer, David Grossman has this enormous capacity for evoking empathy. And strangely, that was something that it felt very held in the background for this novel. And it kind of got in the way, I think. I think people didn't feel there was enough character development. We wanted more of the backstory. We wanted to know more about the time in the camp, about the relationship between the two boys. And then Doverley gets called home, and we know that there's been some devastating...
Are we not going to talk about the devastating news?
But
we're being well behaved.
We know
everyone.
He has
Massive
had some terrible
spoiler.
news, and he doesn't know what it is.
Yeah.
He just knows it's to do with his parents. And so there's a long sequence where he's in the sort of truck and on this journey. And again, this idea of comedy being the way to try and keep feelings of sadness and desperation at bay.
And guilt. This real sense of guilt.
Certainly in other things I've read by him, it's a sort of ongoing preoccupation, and perhaps it's impossible for a writer from Israel to write about anything else in a way. But, you know, with this kind of deeply traumatized population, you know, practically everybody there has some kind of backstory, has a history. It sort of taps into that idea that in a way everybody there is in some way deeply damaged, and it's all just bubbling away under the surface. But on the other hand, I think we were slightly suspicious that it felt very one-sided, and I suppose people who've travelled to Israel, or people we know who...
Have you been?
I haven't actually ever been to Israel, no, but
No, me neither.
I sort of feel sure that, you know, there is this incredible capacity for joy and hope and life. And I think Amanda sort of knew more about it than the rest of us. And she's like, yeah, I didn't really see that. I felt like that was missing. And it seemed a strange omission, because for all it's kind of supposedly a comedy, this book.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Relentlessly downbeat.
And relentlessly painful reading.
Exactly.
Because stand-up, there's always a bit of cringe anyway with stand-up comedy. It's not really my bag, but it's properly cringeworthy when you're reading about it.
And then it's so interesting because during the performance, as people realise that actually they're not going to see some lovely, hilarious, entertaining show, they start to walk out. And as a reader, you very much want to join them. And that was so fascinating, because it was like the author was deliberately using that, almost testing how far he could push you before you just shut the pages and put the book down.
And there was a lot that didn't even need to be in there. Doverley gets quite violent with himself on stage.
Oh yes, I didn't like that sequence.
No, and you just don't quite know. It felt a little bit like, why? It was almost like they had to raise the performance stakes.
Yeah. Ratchet up the intensity. But
Yeah.
I think that's why. And I think, again, it builds and builds and builds. And as a reader, you have to sort of hang on in there, despite the fact that you don't really want to. And what's strange about that is that I think that's what the author very much intends you to feel.
Yeah.
But so there's two issues. I think one is it's masterfully done. I think we all agreed that. But the second is that there's not really a payoff at the end. And that's where we felt perhaps it didn't work. Ultimately, you experience this thing which does come to a certain conclusion. But for most of us, it didn't really leave us with anything to take away.
It falls quite flat. There's no real sort of human connection at the end to kind of, I don't know, sort of lend value to the whole experience.
That was
there was some reason for it.
Yeah, I think that was certainly the general feeling at book club. And it seemed a shame. But then, I mean, people did have really, really strong reactions to this.
It got some really bad scores.
It did. It was interesting when we came to the question about whether you recommend it, which is often something we talk about at the end. And people were like, well, no, I wouldn't recommend this to my worst enemy. Like, why would you want to put anyone through the experience of reading it?
I found it really cringe. Often I had quite like a visceral sort of like, oh, I just don't want to keep reading. I feel very uncomfortable and really alienated, because sometimes the audience is laughing. You're told that the audience is finding these jokes funny and you're just confused. I'm like, I don't understand what you're talking about. How can this be funny?
And that's another important thing, I think, to flag up was, this is a book that has been translated from the Hebrew by Jessica Cohen. And so there was a question perhaps that, possibly a lot of the humour was lost on us. Humour, it kind of doesn't really translate. And it felt like there was possibly a whole layer of nuance to this that we just, with the best will in the world, we just weren't able to access. And I think, having read his other books, he is a good writer. He is. And I felt like I wanted to give it the benefit of the doubt for that reason. But at the same time, the question came, well, if we felt that, it lost a lot in the translation, then why did it win the Booker Prize for a book in translation? Like, they obviously felt there was something to it.
Yeah. Well, it was very well reviewed, wasn't it? Sort of similar to Two Serious Ladies. We're feeling quite alienated from what other people have said about it. The UK papers have reported that it's hilarious and brilliant, and everyone in book club was just a bit, again, puzzled.
I mean, there's one joke about a parrot.
That is a good joke.
Which
We did like that joke.
Yeah, but which actually is an old Jewish joke that I had heard before. It's a classic. It's a very good Jewish parrot joke.
So the author can't like, take any credit for that.
Well, yeah, but then that made me think perhaps, he was tapping into a kind of cultural tradition. Perhaps for a certain number of people reading this, these jokes would be like old friends. So it's so hard to know, but it's true that for us, no one found it funny.
No.
And even giving it the benefit of the doubt, you'd have to wonder whether that's actually just a bit of a misstep. It's just not quite working the way that it needs to. I found it so hard to read. And actually, very unusually for me, if it hadn't been a book club book, I do not think I would have finished it.
Was it a good book club book then?
But I have to say, well, as a discussion book, I think it was. I mean, what did you think? I thought it was a really good discussion book.
It's really difficult because, Two Serious Ladies, there was some things to discuss, but we wouldn't recommend it to anyone. And lots of people didn't even read it because it was such a hard slog. Horse Walks Into a Bar, you're saying you wouldn't have read it otherwise. I'm always a bit borderline because it's like you need to kind of reward your book club sometimes, don't you? Give them something they really want to read and then maybe challenge them. So perhaps it all just depends on sort of timings and what books you've read most recently.
None of us really felt in any way invested in finding out the conclusion. And so ultimately, as a novel, although I think we all thought there were things to admire in it, ultimately as a novel for us, it didn't really succeed. But it was a very, very interesting discussion. I mean, I think you can't deny it. It was a good discussion.
There's a lot of
book.
flashpoints and lots of strong complaints.
So I think it's one of those ones where I think for a book club that's up for a challenge and who really want to be almost sort of tested and stretched a bit, it'd be a really interesting choice. But it's hard to
but you have been warned.
Merrily endorse it. Because it's tough. It's a tough read.
Especially as a Christmas book club read.
Yeah, oh gosh. That's the trouble with reading the Booker winner, because we place ourselves in the hands of the Booker judges. And so over the years, I mean, there was the Christmas that we read A Brief History of 7 Killings by Marlon James.
Some of us read it. I read 20 pages before I put it down.
Yeah, I mean, I actually thought that was amazing. I loved that book. But boy, oh boy, was it kind of visceral and full on. But yeah, it's still, I think, nice way of making sure that we check in with a prize winner once a year. So yeah.
Would you would recommend David Grossman's other books?
I would.
Okay.
To the End of the Land, I absolutely loved, and I would agree with Jacqueline Rose here in the blurb, who says, without question, one of the most powerful and moving novels I've ever read. I did love it, and I do think he's a really interesting writer who people should seek out.
Inspired by our 2 books today, here are some more recommendations you might like to try for your next book club read.
Well, following on from Two Serious Ladies, I thought to recommend The Driver's Seat by Muriel Spark. It's a novella, really, and there's something of that kind of nihilistic, self-destructive quality that Jane Bowles, her characters had. But here, I felt like it was just brilliantly done. There's a kind of clarity and a sharpness to the writing. The main character, Lisa, is incredibly complex, and it's just fascinating to try and work out what's motivating her. She goes on holiday and some events unfold which actually aren't that surprising. It's sort of prefigured quite early on in the novel what's going to happen to her. The pleasure really is in trying to understand why she might have chosen that outcome, and that's a really significant thing as well. Who is in the driver's seat? I think it's a book that's fascinated with the idea of power and control and the choices that women make, and as an antidote to Jane Bowles, I think it would be excellent.
I am going to recommend Grace Metalious' Peyton Place, first published in 1956. Have you read this one?
I've never heard of it.
It is great. My book club read it about 3 years ago now. We still talk about it. It's very well known. Peyton Place actually kind of entered American lexicon as shorthand for a scandalous town. And when it was published, it sold 60,000 copies in its first 10 days of release. It was sort of like the 50 Shades of Grey for that time.
When was it written?
In 1956. And it's about 3 women and their lives in this small New England town. But it covers incest and abortion and rape and murder. And it is very much about women's lives. But these are women that you recognise, perhaps, more readily than you would ever recognise Jane Bowles' Two Serious Ladies. It's a page-turner. There's a lot to talk about. A great book club read.
Sounds really intriguing.
If you'd like to see what we're up to between episodes, follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, or on Twitter at Book Club Rev. That's RVW Pod. Book Club RVW Pod. Or you can always email us at thebookclubreview@gmail.com. And if you're not already, why not subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts?
Books mentioned in this episode were To the End of the Land by David Grossman, The Driver's Seat by Muriel Spark, and Peyton Place by Grace Metalious. You can find out more about the Jilly Cooper Book Club using their hashtag Jilly Book Club on Twitter. Cat recommended Rivals and Harriet, both by Jilly Cooper, of course. Keep listening for our extra bit at the end to hear what Laura made of Philip Pullman's The Book of Dust, Volume 1, La Belle Sauvage, while I got my teeth into Tina Brown's Vanity Fair Diaries. On our next show, we'll be discussing Call Me By Your Name by Andre Asselin, which is Laura's next book club choice.
But for now, thanks for listening and happy reading.
Bum ba da ba ba bum ba da ba ba bum. That's the end bit.
Oh, that's the end bit.
Yeah, it's harder to sing. Dooba 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 doo 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 doo.
Kate's in a choir.
Yeah,
she's got excellent
obviously.
pitch. Obviously. I finally got to read Philip Pullman's The Book of Dust.
Oh, I don't even know if I want to hear about this because I'm saving it. It's going to be my. I've basically kind of earmarked some. I feel like Christmas reading is a bit like summer holiday reading.
It's a very
there's no
special
point
time.
embarking on, my misadventures with Proust. It needs to be stuff where you're going to be quite tired. You're just going to want to kind of, be taken away.
You need story.
Yeah,
you need kind of a story that draws you in and where you kind of know you're going to be in safe hands.
And I felt fairly sure that the new Philip Pullman book would fit the bill. But so, am I going to enjoy it, Laura?
Well, I enjoyed it a lot. I very much enjoyed, I'd say, the first half because it's split into kind of 2 quite distinct sections.
Well, definitely don't tell me how it ends.
No. And I loved it. I've just really enjoyed it. Especially
nice to
the
be
beginning.
Back in that world.
Yeah. And I didn't really want to read it initially because there was something about it being a prelude, is that the word? But it's about events that happen when Lyra's still a baby. And for some reason I never really like going back in time. Like, I don't know, in books I'm always like, no, forward. But no, I really enjoyed it. I read it over, weekend and a bit, but it's too big to take on the tube, which is a good thing actually, because it meant that I was reading other actually I think I was reading A Horse Walks Into a Bar and or Two Serious Ladies on the tube.
Definitely 2 books that you would very much need to offset with something a bit lighter and a bit more enjoyable.
And then I would go home to The Book of Dust.
Have a bit of comfort, like a retreat.
Have you read Philip Pullman's Sally Lockhart mysteries?
No, I've only ever read.
Okay, you should read those too.
Yeah,
they're really good. And actually, my boss recommended them to me, and I adored the first one, and then the second one. It's equally good, but they kill off a main character, and because it's a children's novel, I wasn't expecting that, and I was really upset. And actually, in the Book of Dust,
sort of outraged on behalf of small children who might be.
Outraged on behalf of myself. I wasn't emotionally prepared for that. It's quite dramatic. And you love this character.
For a seasoned watcher of something like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Joss Whedon, you have to learn not to become too attached to any characters, no matter how central they may seem.
Of course. But in children's novels, you're usually okay. People aren't meant to die. And so actually I did read The Book of Dust with some trepidation, but it's not giving away anything to say that it was all right. Yeah.
Yeah, so I've got that, and I've got Tina Brown's Vanity Fair Diaries.
Which looks great.
I just always love a bit of behind the scenes. I'm sort of very attracted, I suppose, by the world of glossy magazines. I don't actually like reading glossy magazines, and almost never do, but I'm really fascinated that they exist, and the way that they're put together. I really, really, really loved the film, the September issue, which was about Vogue, and actually I recently read the Alexandra Shulman diary of Vogue, the 100th year.
Okay.
Which, again, I read it with interest, but I have to say, actually, I was quite impressed that somebody could make such a glamorous job sound quite so prosaic as she does.
It's Alexandra Schulman.
Yeah.
She strikes me as quite a prosaic
It's
sort of manager.
It's kind of fascinating because she did that. She's just stepped aside as editor of Vogue, but
British Vogue, we should say.
that's right. But she did that job for 25 years.
I
So I
know.
mean, by all accounts, did it very well. But I think my main reaction when reading that book was, why isn't this more gossipy? But anyway,
glamour?
I've got
It's
Tina Brown's
and she's got enough glamour.
Vanity Fair Diaries. Well, I don't know. I haven't.
Okay.
I'm waiting with anticipation to see what that world is like. But I also finished the Zadie Smith Swing Time, which I had been reading and I talked about on the last show, which actually I have to say she does draw together very, very nicely.
Well, you're going to have to just pause that thought
Yeah.
because that's my next book club read.
Well, so yes, no plot spoilers, but I think. Last time I was just conscious that I was sort of, yes, there are bits of it which are really amazing, but there are bits of it which I don't feel are working so well. And I think much rests, with a novel on how the author does manage to kind of weave it all together. And actually, I was really impressed by this. It's interesting looking at the quotes on the cover. Many people have sort of referenced the point and said, it's her most successful novel. And I think
exciting,
I would
actually.
agree with that. I think it's true. I think it's the most sort of,
Oh, good. Okay. Because
Yeah.
I haven't always loved her novels in the past. Sometimes she gets a bit too experimental with style. I feel like at the expense of the reader. She's just having a bit of fun and showing off, which, she can do. But that's good to hear. It might be.
So you're reading it for book club?
Yeah.
So I'm actually ahead of the game because I've
Oh,
already read
exactly.
it. So
Yeah.
I just have a month off.
Well, no, yeah, you have to do a refresh.
And I've already aired all my carefully considered thoughts. I'm gonna have to come up with some new ones.
I'll try and have some opinions to ground the discussion.
I'm not sure if anyone ever listens to the extra bit at the end anyway, so probably no one will know.